Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you are doing very well today. Welcome to a little old video called Top 5 Modern Cards I Was Wrong About. This is going to be pretty fun to look back on, and this video comes to us by way of a donation video request from Patreon supporter John. Thank you, John, so much, my friend, for your generous support. And John told me that he likes my theory videos, the best form of content to him that I put out. And he said, I just kind of want to see a theory video. The topic is up to you. It can be something relevant to the here and now, and it can also be something looking back. You know, we can take a look at old theory videos and maybe update them for 2021 or see how they have aged. And I did give this a lot of thought, and with this in mind, I said, you know what? You know what would be pretty cool is to look back on all of the extensive spoiler coverage I have done down the years on this channel and figure out which ones I was really wrong about. So, as you guys know, I'm covering these cards before they're even legal to play, before I have certainly played with them at all, and trying to speculate on whether or not they will rock, they will jund, or generally how strong they will be if they're otherwise momentous or poised to be in the format. And as you might have noticed, as you might have assumed, I do miss sometimes as much as I hit. So we're going to take a look at 5 of the most egregious misses. Thank you once again to John, as well as to all Patreon supporters. Let's dive right into it. Let's take a look at the top 5 modern cards that the Grim Flayer was wrong about. Kicking off the list at number 5, all the way down to number 5, is one of my mortal nemeses, one of my most hated cards of all time, the notorious, the infamous, the villain of the piece, Veil of Summer. And this is all the way down in place number 5. It's not the wildest swing and miss that you've ever seen me have. Kicking off our list here because I was actually correct on most of my points here, but I was wrong on one major one, and that point led my whole analysis astray. So I'm going to quote from my own spoiler coverage here. Quote, "This is an absolute blowout against targeted discard spells, against targeted spot removal, so not only is this good for us against the decks that use those effects, unfortunately, it's also very good against us," end quote. So true, so true, so true, right? So what's the big deal? Well, later in the video, I went on to discuss the anti-blue use cases for the card, and I wasn't shy about claiming that the card would be extremely powerful. Okay, still so far so good, right? But immediately after the above quotation, I proceeded to say this, quote, "It is sideboard only, and it won't see that much play in Modern, I don't think," end quote. That's a bra moment because this wasn't just a one-off remark hastily made. Several times throughout the segment on Veil of Summer, I mentioned my expectation for the card to see only fringe play due to how narrow and reactive it is. Time proved me very wrong in this regard as Veil of Summer ascended the meta to dizzying heights, becoming the second most played card in Modern at its peak, and I did confirm that. I actually thought maybe my memory's deceiving me. I thought for a very brief glimmer of time it was actually the most played. I can confirm that it was at least the second most played, which is the exact opposite of seeing fringe, narrow play, and it is, to be fair, mostly sideboard only, but even that wasn't necessarily true either. We had decks like Neoform main decking it for as long as Neoform was around, basically. So with that said, Veil of Summer, I knew how powerful it would be. I didn't think that many decks would be able to splash for it. And other changes to the metagame, incentivizing more of a green presence, incentivizing maybe a little bit more of a reactive play style, you know, those things definitely made that statement look bad, but let's be clear, it was a bad statement to make in the first place. This card's ceiling is so high, and its floor is so high as well, and it's so efficient for 1 mana at instant speed, and it's not even that narrow, blue or black. Blue or black. Most decks in Modern are playing one or the other, or, you know, a lot of decks in Modern, let's say, are playing one or the other. So Veil of Summer, again, I kind of knew from the jump just how scary this card could be. Did not at all anticipate just how widespread its use would become. Thus, it makes our top 5 list in place number 5. Now, coming in fourth place is Oko, Thief of Crowns, the Simic Heartbreaker, the value-generating machine, a card that every BGX mid-range player has lost repeatedly to, if you were unfortunate enough to play at the time when Oko was the be-all and end-all of the meta. What did I say about Oko when he came out? Quote, "He is an interesting and fairly powerful walker," end quote. Okay, a bit of an understatement, and also maybe not even strictly true. Obviously, he's more than fairly powerful, and is he really that interesting? Well, I thought the design actually had a lot of interesting aspects to it. But the reason why interesting is not the word to use here for good old Oko is because the gameplay could not be more homogenous, especially when Oko's presence itself was homogenizing the format. That's bad enough, right? But the way Oko games play out, they're basically all the same, right? I went on to say, quote, "It is not exactly value positive when we're talking about this +1 Beast Within ability, to be clear. It's not exactly value positive, because whatever you destroy, you leave behind a body. Obviously, a 3/3 elk is going to be mostly worse than whatever you're destroying, unless you're popping one of your own food tokens or something, and that can be a cute synergy." Okay, let's stop myself there. That's a little bit more than a cute synergy. That is a basically unstoppable avalanche of value, assuming you are at parity on board or, God forbid, ahead on board. That's what you do. You've got a high loyalty planeswalker that makes its own loyalty even higher, creates a game object, and then if you're not priced into doing anything else, you just turn the game object into a 3/3, keep going ad infinitum. Again, very samey gameplay, very powerful, far more than a cute synergy, like I said it would be. I went on to say, the final quote I'll pull from myself here is this: "I actually do not think Oko is a good fit in Sultai at all," because remember, on this channel, especially back then, we were talking basically exclusively about whether or not it could fit in a BGX deck. In this case, obviously, it'd be Sultai. And to give myself a little bit of credit here, I went on to explain, springboarding off of that quotation, that Oko would shine the most in shells that do not already have catch-all removal, such as Assassin's Trophy, Abrupt Decay, Maelstrom Pulse, all the BG cards we know and love, because that would make his +1 proportionately more valuable. Now, I do still think that's true, and I do think time proved me correct, because Sultai, Oko, it saw a little bit of play, but we're talking about Bant. Bant was really the game in town as far as Oko was concerned, and a big part of that is because Oko helped make up for the strengths and weaknesses of that color pairing. When you add black into the mix, you're not necessarily playing to Oko's strengths as much. He's not plugging the gaps as well. So basically, I was right about that, but I drastically underestimated the power of Oko. And, if Oko was an appropriately powered planeswalker, let's say something like Liliana the Last Hope, I would have been, on that power level, of Last Hope, I would have been basically right. I would have said, Sultai doesn't want to mess with this. Maybe this is a Simic card, a Temur card, a Bant card, something like that. The analysis in those, which color pairings or which color trios benefits the most aspect, I pretty much got spot on. I drastically underrated his power, and it became to the point where it's not just, is Oko better here, is Oko worse here? It's just like, you just should play Oko. In fact, you should go out of your way to splash for Oko. Basically whatever deck you're playing if you are not already in those colors. So this is where you can get a little bit lost in the weeds in terms of the theory and relativity of Camp A to Camp B to Camp C as far as shells are concerned. You can't lose sight of the forest for the trees. The raw power of this card is what made me so drastically wrong about it. But because I was still kind of right about which colors it would benefit the most from, and because almost everybody underestimated Oko, not just myself, we're only at place number 4 here. And it's been pretty bad so far, guys. I think, though, it's going to get a little bit worse. Let's see what is next. Okay, friends, claiming spot number 3 is a pretty new one. It is Grief. No quotations will be cited here because I covered Grief in kind of an off-the-cuff reaction video rather than a thorough analysis video, but basically there are a few factors here, and don't get me wrong, I definitely thought Grief at first blush would be very, very powerful. I made a deck tech about Orzhov Griefblade, I along with many other people thought this would be very likely a tier 1 strategy in the wake of MH2. So here are the factors aforementioned. Firstly, I overrated the power of the Wombo combo of turn 1, untapped white land plus Grief plus pitchable black card plus Ephemerate. It is very good, but not as game-winning as I expected it to be, especially in the current metagame where fragile to disruption combo decks are almost extinct, and many opposing archetypes have monstrous top-decking power. So basically, to sum that point up again, we are overrating the best use case scenario, and it is also not necessarily a perfect fit for the metagame, which won't always be the case, necessarily, right? But at the same time, the top-decking power that makes Grief not just GG is here to stay, let's make that clear. Secondly, Grief prices you, of course, into playing the color black, but black is probably the worst color to pair with white in an Ephemerate strategy, if you're only looking at one other color, and of course splashing a third color makes this combo itself a lot more inconsistent, because you still need the white land T1, you still need a black card to pitch to Grief, and in general, we all know the fail rate of the third color and the pain and everything else. So I would say that the color black, Grief being black, is actually a big problem here. Why? Well, there aren't many desirable blink targets in black, which makes the Ephemerate plan for doing anything besides this turn 1 Grief a little bit weak, a little bit undesirable, and there is unwelcome redundancy and poor top decking power with too many discard effects. So what I mean by that is if you are playing Inquisition and Thoughtseize, not even necessarily like 6 to 8 of them, even if you're only playing 4 of them to supplement the Grief discard, you're still a little bit behind the 8 ball compared to like a Yorian Ephemerate deck where everything's a good blink target and most things are at least somewhat live as top decks in the late game, even against a hellbent opponent. Grief, of course, not really fitting those bills alongside Inquisition and Thoughtseize, and if you choose to leave Inquisition and Thoughtseize out in favor of leaning only on Grief, you will not be able to disrupt as consistently as you want to, and you're also leaving some of your best cards in the colors on the shelf just in order to accommodate this combo, so it's all a little bit doesn't quite fit together as well as I had hoped and as well as I had anticipated. Adding to this second point here, the clock of Grief is relatively slow. A 3 power with Menace, it's okay, but the shell around it is not really likely to be all that fast. So by itself, relatively anemic, not able to really turn the corner before opponents are at least having a chance, right, to recover from the depletion. And many of our other viable spells alongside the discard spells in these colors operate at sorcery speed, if we're talking about just mid-rangey interactive type cards, maybe planeswalkers to help turn the corner in a value sense after the Grief disruption. All of this does not allow us to maximize the card Ephemerate, because number 1, they might not be Ephemerate targets, they're non-creatures in most cases, and number 2, Ephemerate is a reactive card, incentivizing you into holding it and other instants up, which in a black-white base deck we really can't do all that often. The third and final point here as to why I basically overrated Grief is that Solitude has proven to be arguably more impactful than even the high ratings granted to it by myself and others would have suggested, making the overestimation of Grief look even worse in comparison. Now, this could all change overnight with the rise of like a hyper-fast turn 1 kill combo deck that loses to discard, or the printing of like a black threat with a top class ETB ability, right? These things could happen. Grief is still a very powerful card, it's still a fine strategy, but this is why it makes the top 5, because I overrated it in general. I overrated it by a relatively significant amount, and all of the things that I just went through are good reasons why I should have pumped the brakes and why I should have said, okay, well, you know what? There's definitely something here, but let's not get too crazy. Instead, I jumped on the hype train, I bought a one-way ticket to Grief Town, and now look at us. We're on the list here at number 3, but it's not over. We still got 2 more to go. And here in slot number 2, my friends, is a card that you have seen a lot on this channel, Lurrus of the Dream Den. So, obviously, I covered this card in spoilers. One of the very first things I said in my spoiler vid, quote, "This card is insanely strong if you ask me. Absolutely insanely strong, extraordinarily so, to the point that it might be busted. I'm confident in asserting that this card is very, very strong," end quote. So, despite the, kind of redundant language that I used there, that's actually pretty good, right? Hey, we know how strong Lurrus is right out of the gates. Not everybody did that. Not everybody did, I should say. So why are we up here? It's slot number 2 on this infamous list, where the higher you go, the worse it becomes. Well, here is where I went off the rails, is when I assert that it's not worthwhile to warp one's BGX deck around the card, and that was obviously wrong. I said that Lurrus could be a one of or so in BGX main decks, the classical, traditional boomer build, but had stiff competition for that role. Now let's just stop right there, because it became clear not that long after Lurrus became legal, or at the very least, if we want to be even more generous, not that long after Companion got nerfed, that Lurrus as a main deck threat with the baubles to enable it as a 2 or more likely 3 of in a deck like, for example, BG the Rock, that was a very, very strong way to play. Arguably the strongest way to play it, with the only competition being the Companion Lurrus build, if the results are anything to go by. So I underestimated the card and how well it could compete, even as a main deck option, against traditional mid-range threats, especially if we're talking about straight green-black rock, which is and was my wheelhouse. I really should have seen how this card outcompetes Tireless Tracker, Questing Beast, so on and so forth. Not strictly better, not even close to strictly better, but overall a stronger option, as I think time has proved. So going back to that, like I just said, maybe I said it could be a one of in a main deck and that'd be fine. I undersold it, right? But it gets even worse, because I altogether dismissed the idea of a true BGX midrange deck registering Lurrus as a companion. Despite how highly I rated her as a card, despite how highly I rated the companion mechanic, I knew that mechanic was going to be busted. And lest we forget, it didn't used to be nerfed. It used to be even crazier than it is now. So despite all of that, and despite thinking that Lurrus herself is an excellent companion, among the best, I just still couldn't see a world in which cutting Liliana the Veil and other top-end cards for Rock or Jund was feasible. So, quoting from my conclusion to these Lurrus spoiler videos, quote, "Number 1, the card is obscenely strong in a vacuum. Number 2, it is not worth warping traditional BGX decks around it. But number 3, there could be a really coherent, really strong, really worthwhile BGX Traverse Shell with Lurrus as a companion," end quote. So, my failure here, my friends, is similar to my failure with Oko, in that I'm thinking too much about synergy and not enough about card quality. But this was worse, because not only did I fail to give Lurrus her due, I actually tried to bring us back in time to a worse build by suggesting that maybe Traverse is the best shell for her. Traverse hasn't done the best shell for anything for a really long time. No offense to my Traverse diehards out there. It's just not that viable. The payoff isn't necessarily there. It's a little slow and vulnerable to graveyard hate. If you pull it all together, Delirium's hard to turn on early. If you pull it all together, you're just like a slightly better, mid-rangey or aggro-slanted mid-rangey style deck, right? It's not like GG. So I erred on both sides. I had not only failed to see that Lurrus's raw power could override any concerns I had about synergy, I also, again, tried to shoehorn the idea of her into a shell that is overall less strong than even the classic Boomer shell. Literally just slamming the good card into the existing deck would have been a better strategy than what I was sniffing up the tree for, and that is definitely something to keep in mind, my friends, because once again, you just gotta realize, you gotta respect the power of raw card quality. I failed to do so with Oko, and then again with Lurrus. That's why they both end up on this list. And yeah, definitely a big fail here, right? So again, even though I got most of the aspects of this card correct, we just have to realize that sometimes play the good card, do the simple thing, don't overcomplicate it, give the card some good thorough testing in a wide variety of shells, and you'll see quickly just how powerful some of the designs from this era were. And here, the number one slot, my friends, the most wrongfully slighted card, the card to whom I owe the greatest apology. It is none other than Sexy Hexy, the Hexdrinker itself. And I definitely just got this card wildly wrong. And I put it up at number one for a few reasons. Number one, like with Oko, like with Grief, to name two examples we've covered here, a lot of other people overrated or underrated them respectively too. It wasn't just me. And then with Lurrus, to be fair, there's a lot of moving pieces. I knew the card at least was good. I just was wrong about what types of shells it could force its way into, and it took people a while to really figure that out. With Hexdrinker, this is just a card that from day one could always go into Rock. Now, maybe the exact time it came out wasn't the most friendly, we had a really fast format and stuff like that, but I still should have seen this. I still should have said, you know, if you disrupt, this can turn the corner. You can play it as a Savannah Lions and try to race even when it's really fast and then continue to use your mana to disrupt. And if the format ever slows down, which we kind of knew it would at some point, something had to give in that Faithless Looting meta, then this card gets way better. But I didn't get it right. I'm so sorry, Hexy. You have won me so many matches since I slighted you and told my viewers not to play you. But let's break down exactly why I got this one wrong. So once again with my analysis, even though I got it wrong, I begin with something correct. I correctly identify and explain the value of mana sinks in my Modern Horizons 1 spoiler video that covered Hexdrinker. Now I'll go on to quote myself. Here, quote, "Here is the big downfall of this card and of level up cards in general. You level up only as a sorcery, and that is a much bigger drawback than it probably looks. I mean, there's a reason that none of the level up cards really see competitive Modern play," end quote. So, first of all, this is just a logical fallacy. Just because all the other level up cards have so far not quite made the grade in Modern doesn't mean that another one couldn't, right? And I wasn't just hand-waving it away because it was a level up card, but still a bit of a logical fallacy that I employ there. And the sorcery thing isn't even that big of a deal in Rock. We operate a lot at sorcery speed anyway, and that Rock was all I played at the time of this video, so that was the only deck I was thinking of. So that's not even that big a deal, and finally, to really prove how wrong I was there, level up would be busted in half if it was at instant speed, and I think I did mention that in the video, but still, that just means it's a point I really should not have leaned as hard on as I did. I go on to say, quote, "It's definitely a sweet card, but investing 9 mana is just not realistic. We're not playing counter magic, we're not playing tempo cards." And end quote. And maybe counter magic wasn't the best example there either, but I could say we're not playing protection effects or whatever. Basically, we are liable to getting blown out if we invest a lot of mana into it, and that remains, it always will be true for a card like Hexdrinker, right? But what I failed to see is that the value of mana sinks that I myself kind of laid out in the beginning really makes Hexdrinker so much better. I was kind of tunnel visioning on, well, as a 1-drop, it dies to everything, and then you have to level it all the way up to 9. It's just not realistic. But the power of being able to go turn 1 Hexdrinker and then you draw like a Thoughtseize off the top, or you're waiting for something to Fatal Push and they push it, and then you get to cast your 1 mana interaction, you put another level on. You're turning sideways, you're attacking for 2. This just allows for your curve outs to be maximally efficient at any given stage, provided your opponent doesn't have removal for Hexdrinker. And if they do have removal for Hexdrinker, or if you suspect they do, make them use it. Use it as a Savannah Lions. You trade 1 for 1 on cards, and you trade 1 for 1 on mana. It's really not that bad. We want to make those types of trades anyway. So I think where I really failed to see the full potential of this card is because I was evaluating it too much through the eyes of a perfect progression from my side and of perfect progressions from the opponent's side, or maybe just good rather than perfect, good to perfect, right? And I've said here on this channel that tendency is where people can fail in card evaluation, because yeah, if everybody's functioning relatively optimally, Hexdrinker is not going to get to level 9. Hexdrinker is going to die to something. And you might not even really need a mana sink, and you might not even have the luxury. It might not be optimal to put mana into Hexdrinker, but the thing is, you don't always have those optimal progressions. Like I said, you can draw a discard spell right off the top on turn 2, and then you'll be really happy you have a threat down. You might be really happy you can put a level on it as well, and just continue to be efficient, and you're not sitting there on turn 2, do I play my Thoughtseize, do I play my Tarmogoyf? Nah, you play the Thoughtseize, you invest a mana into Hexy, and that type of imperfect progression, Hexdrinker can smooth out. And Hexdrinker also can steal games that you have no right to steal whatsoever. I failed to see that as well, because even as a top deck, if you just have one window in the late game where you top deck it and get it to at least level 3, a lot of things in a lot of opponents' decks are just going to be a blank against it, right? They're just not going to have an answer. It's going to break board stalls, all this other stuff. I really didn't give it its full due. I compared it to Nimble Mongoose on the one hand as a card that we definitely want no part of in Rock, even though people were asking me about it, and then to Deathrite Shaman on the other hand as kind of the platonic ideal of a 1-drop for BGX. Now, it's true that Hexdrinker does fall into those, in between those two kind of extremes of reasonable 1-drops on the power scale as far as how they fit into mid-range. Here's the thing, though. I thought it was maybe about halfway between or a little bit closer to Mongoose than DRS. I was wrong. It's on the right side of that spectrum. It's closer to DRS than it is to Mongoose by far. Hexdrinker, forgive me. And hopefully, my friends, you have had as much success as I have down these years with Hexdrinker. It is a very valuable addition to the Rock. It's also a card that Rock, with our relatively painless mana base, can leverage the level up a lot more. Whereas on Jonder Abs, and you're kind of looking for a good excuse to deploy a Shockland tapped or something, or wait to fetch a tapped Shockland on the opponent's end step, Hexdrinker rewards us for a painless mana base because each level on average is less painful than it would be in a 3-color deck. So for all of these reasons and more, I should have seen that Hexdrinker would rock right away. I did not, and hopefully, my friends, you can learn from what I've explained here, the mistakes I made, why I made them, what to avoid in the future for your own ability to optimally evaluate cards. All right, my friends, so that was the video, top 5 modern cards I got wrong. That was for you, John. Thank you again for your support. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective, this look back on some of my swings and misses. You know, this axe is heavy. This axe is heavy. I'm a little bit delirious. Every now and then, I'm going to take a swing, and it's going to miss. But which of these cards do you hate the most, and which of these did you get right or wrong? If you have other cards that you got wrong, or that you got right for that matter, you want to talk about any of that in the comments section below, please feel free. But we had Veil of Summer at number 5, Oko at number 4, Grief at number 3, Lurrus at number 2, and the much-beloved Hexdrinker at number 1. So a nice mix of cards that are banned and will never get banned and could potentially be ban risks in the future, and cards that further the BGX cause, totally render it redundant, or maybe like Lurrus are kind of playing both sides. Good with us, very good against us, a little bit hard to discern her motives, but as I say, a nice mix of cards here, all ones that I got at least partially correct in terms of my evaluation of them, but something led me wildly astray, leading my final conclusion to be pretty darn wrong. So there you go, guys. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this one. Everybody makes mistakes, as do I. I had a lot of fun looking back on them. We can all laugh about stuff like that. Now it's a really good time to see how the predictions hold up. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below, and I'll talk to you next time.